Tonight, the UK braces for Trump's big moment as the US president is due to announce a barrage of tariffs. Donald Trump's triumphantly describing it as Liberation Day. We're expecting him to announce tariffs of up to 20% on all imports into the US. Working late and watching closely in Downing Street tonight will be Keir Starmer. He says that constructive talks are still taking place, so maybe Britain could be exempted. Also tonight, Kim Leadbeater, the MP leading the process to legalise assisted dying, warns if MPs throw the issue out of Parliament this month, the conversation on the issue will end. And I'll be speaking to the outgoing Commissioner for Countering Extremism on how he thinks we should define terrorism, the Southport attacks and prevent. But of course, events tonight will be dominated by the words we'll hear from the President during his made-for-TV event from the White House Rose Garden in a couple of hours' time. We'll also be live in Toronto and Brussels as both Canada and the EU wait to hear what's in store. Waiting to hear what's in store with us here, Sir Liam Fox and Baroness Kennedy, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello and welcome to the Politics Hub, and welcome to Liberation Day, the day when America liberates itself, according to Donald Trump, by imposing sweeping tariffs on just about everyone. Now, we don't know the details of the tariffs yet, but we do know the impact. Tariffs make trade more expensive for businesses, which affects growth and jobs, and more expensive for consumers too, who end up paying more for what they buy. And look, we're seeing the impact already. The market is a sea of red on Wall Street. So what is Keir Starmer doing to protect the UK? Well, here he is at PMQs today.
It is important at a moment like this that we don't have knee-jerk reactions, that we are actually cool-headed about this, and that's why we won't rule anything out.
I'll be honest, that means absolutely nothing. The UK's response so far is really a blank sheet of paper. Perhaps we learn more from Rachel Reeves today at the Treasury Select Committee.
We're not going to rush into action to, get a quick headline.
Well, that will be a no. I actually feel that I learned the most from speaking to the Treasury Minister, James Murray, when I interviewed him on the show last night. Now, usually in an interview, you learn something when someone answers your question, but weirdly in this case, I learned something when he didn't answer the question. You can still talk in broad terms about what impact tariffs would have on the UK. What impact would it have?
Well, we're very clear that we want a free trade relationship with the US.
I can talk about that in a minute, but I always find when politicians say, I'm very clear, I don't find it very clear at all. What impact will tariffs have on the UK?
Well, I'm not going to go down the route of speculating because it is hypothetical. Well, it is hypothetical because we don't know what the President is going to announce tomorrow.
Now, I know tariffs will be bad for British business. You know tariffs will be bad for British business. And James Murray absolutely also knows tariffs will be bad for British business. But look, he won't say it. And that is perhaps the clearest example of just how frightened the British government are of antagonising Donald Trump. They don't want to do anything to put that fragile trade deal at risk. And you know what? Because I have been thinking about this. The more nervous they are, the more I wonder maybe some kind of trade deal is actually going to happen. Well, let's cross straight to Washington now, where our US correspondent Mark Stone joins us live. Mark, we're really in the kind of countdown period now. What are we expecting?
A moment, a show, a Trump-style show in the Rose Garden, 4 p.m. our times, 9 p.m. I think your time. He's in the West Wing at the moment. I can see that and the other side of the West Wing out through the French windows of the Oval Office. That leads you to the Rose Garden, and that is where this event will take place. We're told that his whole cabinet will be there. We haven't been able to see the choreography of what it looks like on the other side of the building, but we will soon, because I think for Donald Trump, this is a huge, huge moment. This is his economic agenda unveiled 74 days into this presidency, this second term for Donald Trump. It is the point at which he demonstrates what he believes to be the answer for America's economy, for American industry. You'll remember during his first term, he promised so many times in the campaign leading up to his first victory that he would reopen the factories, that he would bring the golden years back to America. Well, he didn't manage that, and he would blame it on other factors like COVID. Others would say it was his incompetence, which meant that he didn't manage to do it. But he really believes that with the team he's got around him this time, the most loyal people that perhaps he didn't draw in his first presidency, he believes he has got a blueprint which will make America great again, which will make America wealthy again, although some might say it's actually rather a lot more wealthy already than many other countries around the world, and doing very much better. But that leads to a side issue about perception and reality when it comes to the economy. But to your point, we don't know the detail. We simply don't know precisely what Donald Trump will announce. There's been much speculation about whether it will be a blanket tariff, whether it will be sector-specific, whether it will be country-specific, whether it will be bloc-specific. The EU was one bloc. What we do know is that if just a few months ago, perhaps just before the inauguration, there was a view in London, in Downing Street, that special relationship would grant the UK a special place and would grant the UK some sort of an exemption to the tariffs. Well, it became very clear very quickly as this presidency got underway that was not going to be the case. Yes, I think there were some in the British government who thought as recently as last week that they might be able to come up with a deal. But sources I've spoken to, British sources, but elsewhere as well, coming together, the view seems to be Donald Trump is so determined that his way is the right way, and that the exemptions he gave in the his first presidency, when he introduced tariffs then, don't forget that they didn't work, and so that this time there won't be any exemptions. We should see, Sophie, this day as, I guess, the beginning of the process. I think every country has accepted tariffs are coming. Once they know what they are, then the real negotiations will begin, where they can perhaps chip away at those tariffs and throw Donald Trump some bones to be able to get exemptions themselves. Britain would like to see itself as near the front of the line on that, a favourable country, a country Donald Trump likes, a country with a low with low trade barriers, as it would see it at the moment, with not a very big deficit either with the United States. So they believe they're in a good place, and that maybe goes to your point, why they are so careful not to criticise him at all, and why they will not reciprocate when he does whack on tariffs against us.
Yeah, that does feel like that, doesn't it, Mark? I feel like it's going to be one of these evenings because already there are some breaking lines coming out of the White House. All the stuff always starts filtering out about this point. 25% tariffs on cars are due to take effect. That's been reported by Reuters. 25% car tariffs. Mark, what do you think we should... I mean, I guess this is what we're going to expect to see, these really quite hefty, perhaps industry-specific tariffs coming in.
Well, let's take that one then. If that is the case, and we haven't got that confirmed, but let's assume that Donald Trump puts in place a 25% tariff on all foreign cars coming into the UK. Now, quite aside from the fact that, into the US, I should say, quite aside from the fact that many cars that are made in America already actually have parts that go back and forth over different borders, whether it be Mexico or Canada, which would mean that they would become more expensive. American cars would become more expensive. Put that to one side. British cars, Land Rover, for example, Jaguar, who export cars from the UK to the United States, where they sell pretty well, they would suddenly become 25% more expensive if this report is correct. Now, what could Britain do to be able to counter that? Well, there is something that Keir Starmer could do, because at the moment, American cars that are sent to the UK are tariffed at 10%. Now, that is because the UK has kept itself aligned with Brussels from its EU days. The EU has a 10% tariff on cars, American cars. But we're not aligned with the EU anymore. So Keir Starmer could perhaps reduce that tariff of 10% on American cars down to, I don't know, 2% or something like that, which would be potentially a bone thrown to Donald Trump, where he could say, OK, Britain, for cars, that 25%, that doesn't apply. So those are the sorts of discussions that I think we will see that they've been trying to do already. One of the problems is actually getting these facts in front of Donald Trump's nose so that he himself sees them, because he's making the decisions. But these sorts of details and these sorts of negotiations will take place at speed the day after all of this is clear.
And it really is going to be one of those rolling nights tonight where we're getting more information through. White House source telling Sky News tariffs are to be banded by industry and country, which will be, of course, pretty significant as well. Mark, just before you go, there's been a bit of speculation about Elon Musk. Can you just bring us up to speed what's going on?
Well, yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, there's been so much speculation about if and when he and his boss, Donald Trump, would fall out. And I suppose there will be some who see the news today that he may be about to leave the White House and his role here. They will see that as the moment where this fallout has happened. I think there's probably another way to look at it, and it is that Elon Musk's job, whether you see it as him being a wrecking ball or as him being someone who has actually managed to remove bureaucracy and burden from the US government, whatever way you see it, that his job is done. The show that was the Elon Musk show for the first 100 days or so of this presidency is almost done. He's got other companies that he needs to run, whether that be Tesla, which is really having a difficult time at the moment, or SpaceX, or all the rest of it, and that he is actually deciding he's going to leave the White House relatively soon. A White House spokesperson has told our partners NBC that Donald Trump has briefed the cabinet that at some point very soon he will leave, that Elon Musk will leave. It's no massive surprise, I don't think, because he was a special government employee, which means that he is only allowed to serve 130 days in every year. He will have done that by mid-May, and so I think we'll probably see him leaving sometime soon.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Mark Stone there from Washington for us. Right, let's introduce you to our studio guests, and also we're also joined by Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor too, and the former Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, plus the Labour peer, Baroness Kennedy. Great to have you both
nice to be
on
here.
the programme as well. Busy day and lot to discuss. Sam, I imagine that they are having an absolutely fraught night tonight in Number 10.
I think there are going to be a lot of nerves. Look, a week ago, they thought that by Thursday they might have some kind of deal that would avert, in part or in total, what's about to happen in less than 2 hours. Now, Mark Stone was reporting there he doesn't think that's been true for weeks. Funnily enough, people in Downing Street have been saying the reverse. I mean, we don't really know what's going on behind the black door. It's a process of brinkmanship and gamesmanship, and frankly, what they brief us can sometimes not be true. But it would be odd if they were saying we think might be able to get there by Thursday, and that wasn't the case. And I think where that leaves Downing Street is telling the world that it's a time for cool heads and a calm approach and to act in the national interest, because really they've been caught a bit on the hop. Keir Starmer has made a big bet. I think you could argue the biggest bet of his premiership, which is the pose with which he adopts to Donald Trump, which is to be as close as it's possible to be on many issues. And I think what's interesting about the polling is that Donald Trump is incredibly unpopular in the UK. He's amongst the most unpopular of any country. So this is a risk of an approach. But Keir Starmer has hugged him close. But I think in the end, the question for voters will be, does that deliver? And there are questions about whether it's going to deliver on Ukraine and the kind of peace deal around that. And there are questions about whether or not Britain is going to be disproportionately harmed on tariffs. Now, we are going to be subject to tariffs. I think we know that. They could be quite high. That's all the suggestions that we're getting at the moment. The question now becomes, how quickly can we mitigate them? So Rachel Reeves today, before a select committee, was quite clear that negotiations will continue, But the question will be, is Britain one of the first to get the exemptions, partial or otherwise, and how big are they? I think the work does not stop tonight. I think the work in government ups a pace. And, you know, Keir Starmer's played a lot of his cards, things like the state visit with the King in the summer. What other cards does he have left to play?
Yeah, and I guess the other question as well, my question would be, what do they have to do or sacrifice in order to get any of those exemptions as well? Sam, thank you very much indeed. Right. Liam, you are somebody who watches what's happening in the States very, very closely. I'm interested to know what your reaction to, what Sam was saying there is. You know, how likely and how quickly do you think it is that the UK could get some kind of exemptions or trade deal?
Well, it's interesting that there's talk about banding by country as well as industry.
That's interesting.
And I think that the UK's strength there is, although we have a trade surplus with the United States in goods, which is what President Trump looks at, it's almost in perfect balance between the UK's exports to the US and US exports to the UK. So I would have, it's hard to say, we don't know the detail, but if there's going to be banding by country, the UK is likely to be in a good position because we don't have these big tariffs with the US.
So there will still be tariffs, though, right? We don't know what the banding is going to be, so there will still be some.
There'll still be tariffs.
There'll still be some. How big they are is an argument. It's very likely, I would have thought, that they will have much higher tariffs on the EU, because the problem is that there has been an accumulation not of tariffs but of non-tariff barriers. Consumer legislation, environmental legislation, which the Americans look at as a backdoor mechanism for protectionism. And they have a point, incidentally, but they will, I think, see the EU as a much bigger target than the UK.
How do you think Keir Starmer's playing it?
I think that obviously they've come to a realisation that that there's got to be a big display by the president giving his shock and awe announcements later on today, and I think that they've come to realise inside Downing Street that that was how it was going to play. But what they're imagining is that in the days hereafter that they will try and use their powers of persuasion to say we're in one of those special categories, as Liam has said, in that we don't, we aren't, we're pretty much on an even keel with the United States on imports and exports. And so I just think that we're hoping that in the course of the next week that we somehow get ourselves in a better position where we can say, well, look, we've done much better than France and Germany and whatever. I mean, that will be considered success. But we're definitely going to be hit by tariffs, and the consequences of that are real. And also, I just don't understand why, having surrounded himself with, it seems, people who are very ideological, but not stupid, all of them. And some of these people who are in the tech world are very smart when it comes to money, but they're not realising how economically risky this seriously is for the United States of America.
In high inflation, it's like it's a vote killer, right?
Well, it's more than that, because it can lead to inflation, but it also can lead through higher input prices to your own exports becoming more expensive. So it actually threatens your trade in the longer term. So what looks like a comfortable protection in the short term can actually be detrimental. And it's asking the wrong question.
I think it's simplistic economics. I mean, I just don't think he's got the wisest economic advice around him. And, the real risk is that you end up in some kind of depression. As indeed happened. I mean, we were just talking about it earlier, about what happened previously. I mean, it was it's sort of late 19th century when this was tried before. And it was tried before in exactly this Trump way. And it led ultimately to the depression in the United States. And
it comes from asking the wrong question, because the question should not be, how much tariff do I have to add to a German BMW to stop Americans buying them? The real question is, why are Americans not buying American cars? Yeah. And it goes back to consumers will buy what they believe is in their best interest at the right price and the right quality. The real challenge should be to the American car makers, not to try to make life more difficult for American consumers.
Really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Well, the global impact of these tariffs will be far and wide. In a moment, we'll bring you the view from Brussels, but we can first go to Toronto in Canada and talk to Dan Whitehead. Well, Canada really has been in Donald Trump's sights. How's the mood there?
Yeah, the mood is one of worry and real concern. That 25% tariff on cars was announced last month by Donald Trump. And that is what is kicking in tonight here in Canada, and it's already having a huge impact. We are at Ultraform Manufacturing on the outskirts of Toronto in Ontario, which is the province that is the absolute car capital, the manufacturing hub of Canada. More than $50 billion worth of cars head down there, and 80% of cars made in Canada cross the border to the US. This company is quite literally making the nuts and bolts which go into Ford cars, General Motors cars down in the US. This is where they're made, and the impact that we've seen from the tariffs which are kicking in tonight, the concern around those, even though they've not kicked in yet, is already having an impact. The owner of the company here has already had US car makers cancel contracts, 35% of trade down. Just look at some of this machinery. This is the absolute front line of what we're talking about here when it comes to Trump's tariffs. These machines here are making all of those tiny components, the cooling system parts, the brake lines, the fuel line fittings that go into the cars that are driven around the United States. And the real concern is that if that 25% thing, that tariff comes in tonight, as is expected and as we are hearing in those reports, there is no way, we've been told, that the dealerships in the United States are going to pass that cost on to the consumer. And so what we've seen at this manufacturing plant is 4 staff laid off already. The owner saying he's losing sleep and he simply cannot plan. He can't coordinate his staff. He doesn't know week to week whether or not he's going to be able to keep those staff members on. We spoke earlier to the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, the big group really which represents the parts companies just like these right across Canada. And I asked him, how long would it be if this tariff kicks in before we see mass job losses? Bear in mind there's 500,000 people in Canada that work in the automotive sector. How long will it be before we see those redundancies kick in? 1 week is what he said. This is what he told us.
What the president is going to try to do today is sell to the American people his vision of what, to many of us, sounds like a mercantilist system of the 19th century. None of that will matter if he puts tariffs on the auto sector, and the industry will shut down within a week. There's 950,000 Americans who make parts and cars and tools for the parts and cars in states that delivered the presidency. And they won't be debating the price of eggs at that point. They'll be worried about making rent like Ontario auto workers are.
We know about the 25% tariff on completed cars. There's a tariff coming in by May on parts. That is the concern. But such is the integration in the supply chain of car parts. And we heard from Mark earlier how it works, that actually you can have a car part, a tiny car part that is made in, starts life in the United States, it gets exported here up to Canada, it gets then exported down to Mexico, and then back and forth. In fact, the average car part gets exported around 10 to 12 times in North America before it ends up in a car, so it is absolutely integrated. So we talk about specific tariffs in one sector, whether it's parts or completed cars, but as soon as those get implemented, the domino effect kicks in. There's something else to mention here, the backdrop in Canada. Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister here in Canada, when he came in within the first few days, he called a snap election, a snap federal election. That's going to take place at the end of this month. And the rhetoric, the fractious relationship between the United States and Canada is front and centre of that election campaign. Trump's message to Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States. You speak to anyone in downtown Toronto, in the manufacturing sector surrounding the province here, that is all they're talking about. So not only is this costing jobs already, not only is there concern that there could be tens of thousands of job losses, of course it's the consumers as well, both in Canada and America, who are going to see those prices shoot up vastly. And the real fear here is whether or not the sector, a sector that is so ingrained in Canada and such a huge part of the economy, in excess of £50 billion, whether or not it can survive. And the relationship between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister here, and that relationship is front and centre of that election in just a couple of weeks.
Dan, thank you very much indeed. Dan, can I just shout out to your cameraman as well, because that was some impressive backwards walking in a very busy environment, which is not bad going at all. Right, let's cross to Brussels now, shall we? Because, of course, the EU is saying that it will respond at the appropriate moment to the tariffs imposed by the US. We can talk now to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons. Adam, what's going on?
Well, they're burning a bit of the, if not the midnight oil, and they're certainly keeping an eye on what's going on in America. There's an atmosphere, I'd say, of a certain amount of anticipation, not exactly excitement, but there's one of those nights when something is brewing here in Brussels, because obviously they can see the storm coming. We know about these big tariffs on cars, for example. Now, by my reckoning, back of an envelope calculation, the average price of a European car sold in America at the moment is 51,000 euros. 750,000 of them sold in America every year. So that one, with a 25% tariff, goes up by 13,000 euros. That is a tough sell to an American consumer, particularly when presumably Hondas, when Kias and various others are all going up by the same amount as well. So what do the Europeans do? Well, the first thing they do is they will wait. We know exactly how European institutions operate on this. They look at how Donald Trump is running America, and frankly, they're trying to do the reverse. They will say they will wait, they will analyse, they will consider their response. They do not want to be seen as people who sort of jump into action like a hair trigger. But that said, there has been plenty of consultation has already happened here in Brussels and round the various capitals. And I think you have to look at this in two ways. One is about the economic impact. The European Union feels that sometimes it gets beaten up and put down by America. And at this point, there are plenty who think they need to stand up for themselves and they need to prove that they are a tough, resilient economy that will not bend over and appease Donald Trump. And that's where we get into the area of politics as well, because this place knows that this is a test of its resolve. And also, there is a feeling that many voters around Europe, particularly some of the sort of quiet majority, really don't like what they're seeing across the Atlantic. They consider Donald Trump to be a bully, and they want to see their national governments, or maybe these international institutions, stand up to him. So put that all into the mix, and tonight we have this tariffs. Now, we know that the EU is an institution that loves doing trade deals, but they also know that viscerally they hate the idea of tariffs. I mean, the entire basis of the EU is to try and create a free market for its members. So I think they will come up with reprisals. In the first instance, if they don't think these tariffs are too desperate, they'll certainly go for emblematic things, whether that is American bourbon, whether that is jeans or Harley-Davidson motorbikes. But there's a growing feeling, Sophie, that they're going to be tougher than that they're going to have to do things that hurt America. Got to be clever, because they don't want to really put tariffs on products that they need to import into Europe. So the word at the moment is that they are looking at a pretty combustible solution, and that is to take action against high-profile American high-tech companies, the likes of Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple, companies who've already had big battles with these institutions over the past few years, and which in some cases are seen as being close to Donald Trump. And the final thing I would say is there are lots of people here, lots of people around Europe who have said, can't we just put a big tariff on Tesla? Elon Musk is seen as the emblem of the White House as much as Donald Trump. I don't think legally they can just put a tariff on Tesla. But if they were trying to do something that was popular with a lot of European voters, that's what it would be.
Oh, I can really imagine that. I can imagine that coming up. Adam, thank you very much indeed. Well, there's still an awful lot of uncertainty, and whenever there is uncertainty, the one person we can rely on to try and shed some light in the darkness is our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. He's been crunching the numbers as always. Ed joins us now. What could the impact be?
Well, I have to say, Sophie, I've been covering this topic, economics, for the last kind of 2 and a bit decades. In all that period, trade economics has been about the most boring economic sector of all. No one cares about this stuff, honestly. It's really difficult for me to kind of get anyone to listen when I'm talking about this. And yet here we all are, watching with bated breath to find out what Donald Trump does on trade economics. So at least, you know, if nothing else, he has raised the profile of this quite obscure element of economics. Why has he done that? Now, we'll have a look at this. I'll show you a few charts, Sophie. When we're talking about the amount of uncertainty, so what this is showing you here is just how many times people are mentioning kind of trade uncertainty in particular in newspapers. It's just an index of how interesting this stuff is to people and how concerned they are. And you can see that was the last presidency of Donald Trump. That red line is when the election happened. Just look at where we are now on this chart. Totally unprecedented territory. And I think for a lot of people, they're hoping that this is the moment that at the very least ends that uncertainty. But in order to end that uncertainty, you know, what are the actual numbers that we're going to hear about? And as you're saying, Sophie, still no one knows for sure. Little bits dribbling out. You know, we're hearing there's potentially going to be tiered levels of these tariffs, that we're going to get different levels for different countries, different levels for different industries. But just have a look at this, OK? Because when there's been all this talk recently about reciprocal tariffs, and what does that mean? Essentially, one of the things Donald Trump has talked about is he's very upset that different countries around the world have higher tariffs on America than America has on them. And so you can kind of look, you can visualise that. And what we've done here is we've just taken that. So for India, it's about 10% higher than the tariffs in the US. Germany, about 1.2% higher. There's Vietnam, 5.4%. But here's something striking. Look, the UK has lower tariffs on America than America has on the UK. So that really does matter, that bar there. However, here's the thing. For the US and for a lot of people in the White House, it's not just that they're looking at. They're looking at all sorts of other things as well. They're looking, for instance, at how high everyone's VAT and sales tax is. Now, for most people, almost every economist, I should say, VAT is not the same as a tariff. It's just not the same. However, for lots of people in the White House, they say, look, we're counting that as a trade barrier. And if you include VAT, so we've added sales taxes to all of these kind of levels of tariffs, then suddenly everything is different. And suddenly the UK looks like it's a country not necessarily to be trusted, or rather certainly to be treated with some big change when it comes to taxes and tariffs. This is one other thing that has been looked at by the White House, which is not just tariff barriers, but what are called non-tariff barriers, basically regulations that get in the way of trade. And again here, look, the UK is quite high, partly because of all of the regulations that we have by dint of being part of the EU, and obviously we've left the EU, but still lots of those regulations are still in place. Final thing, just to give you a sense of the historic nature of what we're talking about here. This is showing you the average level of tariffs in the US going back all the way to 1891. And you can see that bit there. That was the 1930s, and that was known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tariffs. And a lot of people thought that was contributing to the Great Depression. We went down along. But right now, if these tariffs are quite as aggressive as a lot of people have been talking about, then you could see that line going up all the way into the stratosphere. But we just don't know. We just don't know. Look at that. That's just an illustration of where things may end up. But we don't know for the time being. That's why everyone is waiting to find out those details about which country faces which tariff, which industry is facing which tariff, and when are they being phased in. And we hopefully will hear more from Donald Trump about that. Hopefully we'll get more detail, and we'll let you know all of that detail as we have it.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. Really clear there. Well, of course, what the hell is happening on tariffs is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the Mail's Claire Ellicott. Right, we can talk again to Celine Fox and Baroness Kennedy. We don't know what's going to happen. We're going to get a bit more information in the next couple of hours. We don't know how long it's going to last for. We don't know if there's going to be any exemptions. But this uncertainty is so difficult for politicians here and around the world to deal with, right?
Absolutely. But what's so interesting about all of this is that I mean, it is interesting, and Liam was just bemusedly saying to me as a Brexiteer, as distinct from me as a Remainer, isn't it interesting that the government, full of Remainers at the top, are now having to use this sort of, we're not Europe, therefore we might get a special deal.
Brexit
so we're
freedoms, right?
Yes, it's part of the Brexit freedoms.
But,
well, we'll see whether there is a payoff. But what's interesting about the business of the European Union is that, and we will have decisions to make, is that I believe that behind an awful lot of this is the self-interest of the tech billionaires who are very resentful of the way in which they feel that Europe is putting regulatory limitations on them. And there's a piece of legislation that went through, the DRA as it's called, which is Digital Regulation Act. And they want it out. They really do. And someone was saying to me, I was at a conference in Copenhagen recently, and someone from the Council of Europe was saying, listen, it's going to be, do you want us to be in NATO or do you want the DRA?
Wow.
Right?
That's so interesting.
And that's the conversation that's taking place in other parts of Europe.
And you're hearing it in the UK as well, right?
Yeah,
Because
in the
there's a
UK
lot
too.
of noises about whether or not the digital services tax, for example, is going to be reduced as part of a trade deal, right?
So you see, the deal that I'm anxious about is that our government goes into discussions with the United States of saying we're different, and we'll try to be much more deregulatory in relation to the stuff to do with social media and digital.
And there's another completely different area that no one is talking about, which is if you apply tariffs at a flat rate to everyone around the world, if you make it more difficult for poor countries to trade their way out of poverty, then what you're likely to do is produce a big displacement and increase migration.
That's interesting.
And,
That's very interesting.
And so it happened last time, and I said to the previous American trade rep that, you know, you might be able to protect your Rust Belt, but watch your borders. Yeah. And if in a world where things are very, very integrated in the global economy, if you cause a big disruption, it is likely to produce social dislocation, and that is one of the great big drivers of migration. So there's a lack of understanding, I think, in general, about the link between trade policy. Ed says no one's interested in trade economics. I was.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like free trade bananas, and stuff like that, which feels like kind of or free trade chocolate, because actually I guess, you know,
or citrus fruit
really
from South Africa.
This, how important it is to have free trade with countries that are actually trying to
you've
grow.
got a country like South Africa, which has got a huge amount of citrus fruit as an export, you slap a 20% tariff on that, and you can produce quite a big disbenefit in terms of social policy. So these things are the interaction between trade and economics and security is not very well argued, and because our government systems are very siloed, the people who make the rules on economics very seldom will be talking to the people who have to deal with the security fallout.
We'll have much more from both of you later, including self-professed trade geek Liam Fox as well. You're watching the Politics Hub coming up. The MP leading the assisted dying bill warns that if MPs throw the issue out of Parliament this month, the conversation on the issue ends. But there are concerns from others that safeguarding has slipped. We'll have the latest on the bill. Plus, more details are coming out on what we can expect to hear from Donald Trump in the White House Rose Garden in just an hour and a half's time. Stay with us.
Over there, to your left. There have been airstrikes every day. Hezbollah are very sensitive about us showing any pictures, and we're being hurried away right now. It felt akin to riding into some sort of Armageddon. Many other areas have been hit badly. There are shells coming in every few minutes. Hear that whistle and that crunch? We know that they're coming from the south of the city, where there's a column of Russian armoury. I'm Alex Crawford, and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
It's trying to hit us. That's it. It got us then.
There's a lot of action going on. A lot of hits. Still, we were the first journalists and the only outsiders to reach the site of the attack several weeks after it happened.
We found from the missile.
It's very difficult to see what around here could be conceived of as a legitimate military target.
Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, boat seriously overcrowded.
This is one of the most severe viruses in the world. Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at that sheet of flames, and that has happened within minutes, and now it's coming from both sides, and it's moving this way.
world's largest falls, now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa!
Getting up close and personal with a rhino.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Hello, welcome back. Now we're joined by our political correspondent, Ali Forsky. It's nice from the same politics hub, as you have to say, Ali. Because we had a press conference earlier held by Kim Leadbeater, the MP leading the assisted dying legislation. Ali was there. What happened?
I was, and I was actually at the very first press conference that she gave, and the mood then, was pretty optimistic. I think there is still optimism, but it felt incredibly charged and nervous because I think they know that it actually wouldn't take a huge number of MPs to change their minds for the assisted dying legislation not to go through. I'm going to remind you the numbers, Sophie. Here we go. OK, so it was a 55 majority for assisted dying. This was last time round. But here you go. In the red over here, that is 28 MPs that would need to change their minds for it not to go through. And that is actually, it's not a massive number. And I do sense there are some people I've talked to that are wavering.
So just 28 MPs would need to, who voted for assisted dying last time, if they change their minds, that's it.
Exactly. And, I think a lot of them voted because they wanted to see it debated and they wanted to see what happened in the next stage as the scrutiny, which is what we've had now. But Kim Leadbeater, as you say, she's been spearheading all of this. She says she's not worried. This is what she had to say.
I'm not particularly worried, I have to be honest. I don't know the MPs that you're referring to, but certainly I've had conversations with MPs who have changed their minds, who voted no at second reading or abstained at second reading, but will now come and support the bill. So there might be some movement, and I'm very respectful of that. But I do think that the general feeling in Parliament is that most people who voted for the bill will continue with that support.
I guess just picking up on that, MPs really wrestled with their consciences last time. My question might be, why would they change their minds this time around?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few different reasons. There's quite a few things that have changed. This is something that comes up a lot. So we've talked a lot about the role of a High Court judge. Here you go, this was the original bill. High Court judge was going to play a role in overseeing people making decisions about ending their life. That has changed, and this is a new amended bill. So here we go. So it's now a panel of experts. So a legal member, that's effectively a kind of senior lawyer, psychiatrist, and a social worker. So this is this kind of panel of experts. Kim Leadbeater says it's more safeguards, so it's strengthened the safeguards.
But I guess it is a change, right? Before you need a High Court judge signing it off. This time it's a panel of experts. So I guess people could change their minds.
Yeah, it's different, Sophie, for sure. And, I think there are a few things, we don't have time to go through all of it, but the other thing is the implementation deadline has been extended 4 years. That could mean that assisted dying legislation comes in implemented in the middle of an election campaign. Could it be politicised? That is a concern that some people have. I'm going to play you someone on the other side who voted against assisted dying. This is Naz Shah, and she was also, I should say, on the committee that scrutinised it. Here we go.
I'm absolutely clear on a principal point of view. There's nobody in this House, any MP, that doesn't want to end intolerable suffering. What I'm concerned about is this bill doesn't have the safeguards it needs for Parliament to pass a legislation. It's absolutely flawed.
Should we end with these two? Shall we recognise them? Rupert Lowe, former Reform MP, Lee Anderson, current Reform MP. They are two people who have told Sky News they voted for it and now they're going to vote against it. Beyond that, I've spoken to a few wavering Labour MPs who are thinking about it, but no one has actually confirmed to me that Labour MPs, that they have 100% changed their mind. I think there's going to be some really deep thinking over Easter. They'll be back after the recess. 25th of April, we expect, is when the report stage is going to start. 16th of May, when there's probably going to be the next big vote on this. Massive consequences, Sophie, obviously, beyond Westminster.
Ali, thank you very much indeed. Hugely important legislation there. Now, Robert Simcox was appointed by the government as its Commissioner for Countering Extremism in 2021, and his 3-year term is coming to an end in the summer. I've been speaking to him about how he thinks we should define terrorism. Now, on the Southport attacks, he told me he doesn't think the killer meets the definition of terrorism. I sat down with him a bit earlier. It's worth listening to his explanation. Thank you very much for talking to us. So you're kind of recently announcing that you're leaving your role, and it feels to me like your kind of parting message is that ideology is at the heart of terrorism. I just wondered if you could explain what you mean by that.
Well, yeah, so first of all, great to be with you. Secondly, we have recently produced a study which looked at 100 convicted terrorists over the course of some 2 decades and over 6,000 pieces of electronic material they collected. And what this study demonstrated is that terrorists don't just dabble with ideology, they immerse themselves in it. They take it seriously, they try and understand it. And this gets to a tension that has existed in the field of terrorism and extremism for some time, as to what extent do the power of ideas drive people's actions as opposed to other factors such as socioeconomics. Now, that's not to say there is no role for personal factors, because clearly they are in the mix with ideas as well. But what this study shows is that ideology is absolutely central to explaining why terrorists do the things they do.
It feels like your emphasis is quite different from the government's. They're talking about, lone wolf terrorism being on the rise. The nature of terrorism has changed, according to the Prime Minister. Do you think there is a bit of a conflict there?
Well, I think that this research actually is really helpful to government because it's so evidence-driven. It's based on case studies. It's not based on hypotheticals. It's based on decades of experience.
But do you agree with the government that the nature of terrorism has changed, or do you think that actually they're wrong?
Well, it gets to the question about what we're talking about, and I think this has been really brought into stark focus by the debate over Rue de Picana, which has led to
the Southport killer.
The Southport killer, about whether this was terrorism or whether, in the words of the Independent Review of Terrorism legislation, it was violence that terrorises. Because there are very different consequences to the answer to that question. If you consider Rue de Picana to be a terrorist, then there is a whole counter-terrorism apparatus which comes into play. But my suggestion on that would be that you would potentially overwhelm the system, and the authorities wouldn't have the capacity to be able to deal with the risk of all individuals out there who are, let's say, fixated in violence but have mental health issues. My concern would be you would create so many haystacks that you wouldn't be able to find the needle anymore.
So just to be clear, you think then that actually Axel Rue de Picana, the Southport killer, shouldn't be classified as a terrorist?
Well, I don't think he meets any definition of terrorism that I have seen. Obviously it's a live conversation, and honest people can disagree on this. And obviously the act of violence in Southport was so horrendous that I understand the need for people to attach what they feel like can be the most serious label to it. But just because, let's say, if Rue de Picana is not considered a terrorist, that doesn't make the act of violence any less serious. It doesn't mean we should treat it any less seriously. It just means it doesn't necessarily fit into the counter-terrorism model we currently have.
One of the things that came out was that he watched a lot of extreme violent material online. I just wonder if, that kind of falls into the terrorism category, because it's almost like, could he have been radicalised to have an ideology online himself? Or do you just think is it just unhelpful to even bring terrorism into it?
Well, he did look at content we would consider terrorism, like Al-Qaeda manuals, Al-Qaeda content. But he also looked at a whole range of other things. He looked at provisional IRA content. He looked at content to do with genocide. It was this whole diverse range of grim topics, essentially.
It's almost like he was obsessed with violence.
He was fixated with violence, but he didn't have the ideological framework attached to it. And I think that creates a real challenge for the preventative system in general, because if you're looking to divert that person away from committing an act of violence, if they don't have an ideological framework attached to them, how do you begin to have that conversation? What is it you're essentially trying to divert them away from. It's not like an Islamist ideology or an extreme right-wing ideology. It's an obsessiveness with violence for the sake of it. And that, I think, is those sorts of people fixated with violence have long existed, but now, of course, they have access to nihilistic chat forums, or they have access to terrorist manuals online, and it obviously makes it a slightly different challenge to the ones in the past.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about prevent just being overwhelmed if the definition is too broad. I mean, do you think that prevent is fit for purpose?
Yeah, I think prevent is a really important part of our counter-terrorism apparatus. It's getting to people, trying to divert people away early from committing acts of terrorism seems to me one of the most vital things you could do. I've also said prevent is not unimprovable, and there was an independent review at the start of 2023 that outlined dozens of recommendations. They've since been implemented. There is an independent commissioner for prevent, Lord Anderson, who's been appointed, who is also going to look to refine the system. But I would support refining what prevent does. I think clearly there are improvements to be made. But I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I do think it's an important programme.
How much of a threat is Islamic terrorism?
Well, it remains the key terrorism threat we face today. If you look at the counter-terrorism police or MI5 casework, Islamist terrorism remains the driving force. It's interesting because we talk a lot about the diversification of the terrorism threat, diversification of extremism. Those things are true, they are. But if you look at the day in, day out threat to life in this country, Islamist terrorism remains the driving force. It's been the case for the 4 years I've been in this job, and it's also been the case for a couple of decades beforehand.
Do you think the security risk has changed because of what we've seen in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I think that what happened in Gaza was potentially seismic in terms of its impact for the threat landscape in the UK. I think what was uncorked, essentially, by what happened in Gaza, some of the sentiments we saw being aired about Jewish people in the aftermath was, I can't say it surprised me, but I understand it shocked many people the way it played out. Of course, there was a pre-existing, well-entrenched Islamist terror threat facing this country, but I think what happened in Gaza has amplified that. I think the consequences of it are going to be played out for years to come, similarly to the way in which other major terrorist attacks, 9/11, the July 2005 bombings in London, had a major impact on security for years to come. I would expect similar to happen in the post-7/10 landscape.
It's interesting to hear you say that. It's almost like the kind of horrors that happen and radicalise people as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the grim truth is around this is that after 9/11, the threat landscape increased. Now, most people, the vast majority of people in the world, see these sorts of terrorist attacks and are repulsed by them. But to the terrorist groups who mean us harm, it's a fantastic shot in the arm because it shows, look, we can hurt the West, we can hit the West. Their security architecture isn't infallible. We can pull these things off, and we've seen it again and again. I mean, United States, Europe, Israel, Australia. I mean, that terrorism takes place all over the world, and it acts as a driver when the West especially gets hit in the way it does.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's a very thought-provoking interview. Helena, you've done a lot of work in this area. What did you make of what was said?
Well, I've done a lot of terrorist trials, from Irish through Middle East through to jihadist trials, and I agree with him. I actually do think that it is ideologically driven, and it is of a very different order from some of those cases where people have been, sort of have mental health issues, are sitting in a bedroom looking at computer stuff. They want to do some horribly violent thing, and they're feeding themselves with violent imagery, and it's like the shootings in America that you get individuals going off and doing, and then they're happy to die but to be made famous, they think. And I think that those things are quite different, though I do think that you can get the sort of lone person who becomes ideologically driven by going online, and there are actually people whom they interact with who actually are educating them and radicalising radicalising them, and I've done cases where that kind of radicalisation has taken place to young people in bedrooms.
But I guess it's not, like you say, it's not kind of comparing how bad something
not all of
is.
it.
It's just the root that someone's got there.
And I think the ideology thing that he's referring to is absolutely right.
So do I, and I think that we actually have to be more upfront in calling out these extreme ideologies. You can be too tolerant of some of these groups. I think of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and some of what they propagate. But you also, at the same time, have to, in the real world, try to detoxify some of the real world environments that will actually give rise to and support some of this extremism. So the two things actually have to be done.
And some of them are on the very extreme right, and are not, jihadist.
It's a very good point. Really interesting debate. Thank you both very much indeed. Now, just to end, we wanted to bring you an update that's just happened in the last hour on a story we've been following here on Sky News surrounding the former anti-corruption minister Tulip Siddiq. Our political correspondent Rob Powell has caught up with her.
Well, the truth is, there's been allegations for months on end. No one has contacted me, and they need to speak to my lawyers if they have any allegations.
Is this all a smear, or do you regret any of your links with the Awami League?
Why don't you look at my legal letter and see if I have any questions to answer? But my lawyers are ready. They have not once contacted me, and I'm waiting to hear from them. So
do you think you could have been more vigilant about some of your financial links?
Rob, you've been tracking the story for a while, haven't you? What do you make of what she said?
Yeah, we've been. It's the first time we've heard from Tulip Siddiq since she stepped down from government as city minister. We've been trying to put some of these questions to her. That's the first time we've managed to talk to her on Whitehall a little bit earlier. I think what we can take from it is that, despite the fact she had to resign, she's going to fight her corner, that she feels she's done nothing wrong. And I think as well that she feels that the way some of this has been handled by the authorities in Bangladesh is sort of back to front. There have been briefings, documents that have been put out in the public domain, including given to us at Sky News, that essentially name her in some corruption investigations in Bangladesh. But despite all of that, Tulip Siddiq says she hasn't been contacted. That's partly why a few weeks ago she got lawyers to write a letter to the Bangladeshi government, to the Anti-Corruption Commission there, essentially saying, if you've got any questions, then you need to put them to me by this date at the end of March. And what she is saying today is that she hasn't heard back. So behind the scenes, those close to her say, look, the ball's in the Bangladeshi authorities' court there. We've approached them. They were quite punchy when we went back to them last time and essentially put out a statement saying she spent most of her adult life residing in homes owned by the cronies of the notoriously venal Awami League regime. So I guess the ball is back in her court now, but we also revealed UK investigators could get involved in that, so there may be longer to go on this story.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we're going to keep pursuing this as well. Thank you very much. Well, that's it from us tonight, but there is an awful lot of news still to come this evening because we are, of course, expecting the announcement of the Trump tariffs. It's Liberation Day. We're going to find out the details. And, of course, that isn't the end of the fight. It's just the beginning when it comes to the UK government. We'll have full coverage on the UK Tonight with Mark Barbett. And then, of course, we've got The World from 9 p.m. But really, there's only one show in town. Tonight is the Donald Trump show. And it's going to be as unpredictable as ever.